I am 77 years old. I poisoned a man in the spring of 1868, and the town called it justice, and I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. That is what I want to say before anything else, because everything else, the years before it and the 50 years after, only makes sense if you understand that I have been carrying two things at once this whole time. What the town decided it was, and what I know it was. And the distance between those two things is what I am finally prepared to measure out loud at 77 and whatever time I have left. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. I was born in the spring of 1844, second child of Gordon and Lavinia Coombs, in a county of Alabama that was mostly red clay and river bottom, and Baptist churches spaced 2 miles apart. My father farmed cotton on 40 acres his own father had cleared. We were not poor by the measure of that place and time, which is to say we ate well in summer and thinly in February, and my father did not owe more than he could likely pay. I had one older brother, James, and 2 younger sisters, both of whom I helped raise from the time I was old enough to carry them on my hip. The house was 4 rooms and a covered porch. My mother kept a kitchen garden along the south side, beans and collards and sweet potatoes. A few rows of herbs she used for remedies when remedies were needed. She was known in the neighborhood as a woman who knew plants, not in any particular way that anyone made much of. It was simply that when something ailed you, Lavinia Coombs might have something in a jar that would help. She dried what she grew and kept the preparations on a shelf near the back door, in small tins and clay pots and whatever containers held. I helped her sometimes, learned the names, learned what mixed with what, and what you kept apart. I am telling you this because it matters to what I did later, and because I want to be precise about where the knowledge came from. It came from my mother. She taught me without teaching me, the way most things got learned in that life, by watching, by handling, by being asked to fetch or measure or stir. The tin I used was small, about the size of your closed fist, with a lid that fit tight enough to keep moisture out. My mother had a half-dozen like it. They were ordinary, the kind a family accumulated over years, originally holding tobacco or tooth powder or something bought at the general store in town. When a tin was emptied, you cleaned it and used it for something else. That was the whole of their history. There was nothing particular about the one I chose. I picked it because it was the right size, and it was clean and the lid fit. I am getting ahead of myself. I do that now. At 77, a person gets tired of the long way around. What I want to say about that time, 1844 to the start of the war, which is the part of my life that preceded what I did, is that it was ordinary in the particular way that lives in that place, were ordinary. Church twice on Sunday, circuit preacher every 3rd week, the same 20 families within riding distance that we had always known. Cotton planted in April, laid by in July, picked starting in September, hogs killed in November when the cold finally held. Christmas observed but not elaborated. New Year came and went without much ceremony. The seasons were the calendar, and the calendar was the work. Aubrey Finch was part of that calendar from before I could remember. His family farmed the land 2 properties over from my father's, separated by a creek and a stand of sweet gum that had been disputed at some point before my time and was no longer disputed but also never quite resolved. He was older than me by 12 years or so. I knew his age only approximately, the way you know the ages of people you have always been around without ever having occasion to count. He was a man in the county. He had weight in the county. He went to the same church. I want to say that clearly. He was a specific person with a specific face and specific habits and specific ways of talking. He was not a shadow. He was not an idea of harm. He was a man who stood in the churchyard after service with his hat in his hands and talked about the weather and the price of seed. And he was also something else, and those two things existed in him at the same time. And I have thought about that for 50 years. The tin sat on the shelf near my mother's back door through my whole childhood. It held dried pennyroyal for a while, then something else, then nothing. By the time I was 20, it had been empty for a year or more. I knew exactly what it looked like. I knew exactly where it was. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. The war came when I was 17. I am not going to tell the war at length because that is not what this is about. But I want to say what it did to the county, to the specific place I lived, because without that, you cannot understand the years that came immediately after. And without those years, you cannot understand what I decided to do. The men went. My brother James went in the summer of 1861 and came back in the winter of 1864 with a hand that had been taken off below the wrist in a quietness he never entirely recovered from. My father was too old to go, or near enough, and stayed on the farm with my mother and me and my sisters. We kept what we could. We lost animals, lost equipment. There were seasons where we planted and harvested with 4 women and a one-handed man, and the cotton brought less than it had because everything brought less, and we ate more thinly than we ever had. Aubrey Finch went and came back. I do not know what happened to him in the war. I know only that when he returned in the summer of 1865, he was the same man he had been before, and also somehow more plainly what he had always been, as if the constraint that ordinary life placed on a person had loosened. He was not changed in the way some men were changed. He was simply less careful about concealing what was already there. I was 21 by then. I understood things I had not understood at 15. The specific harm he had done to at least 2 women I knew by name was not a secret exactly. It was the kind of information that moved through a community of women without ever acquiring the form of an accusation. You knew what you knew. You kept it in the same place you kept a lot of things. My mother knew. She had known for years. We did not discuss it directly. The way we did not discuss it was itself a kind of discussion. By the spring of 1866, I was 22, and my parents were talking about marriage in the particular way parents of girls talked about marriage in that place. Not urgently, but steadily, the way you might talk about needing to repair a fence, something that needed doing before winter. There were not many men to choose from after the war. The county had lost more than its share. Silas Beale was one who remained. He was 31, a widower, farmed his own land, owed nothing that anyone knew of. He was quiet and deliberate. He was not unkind. I want to say that plainly. I chose Silas Beale, and I chose him because he was a reasonable choice, and also because I understood at 22 that marriage would put me on a particular piece of land at a particular distance from Aubrey Finch, and that distance would be of use to me. That was not the only reason I chose him, but it was one reason. I've never told anyone that before. We were married in November of 1866. The ceremony was at the church in the afternoon, dinner at my parents' afterward. It was not a large affair. My mother cried, which was the first time I had seen her cry, and one of the only times after. She was not a woman who cried at things. I have wondered since what she was crying about. I have not settled on an answer. I took the 10, not then, not on the day I married. That sounds more deliberate than it was. What happened is that over the following months I moved my things to Silas's house, and at some point in that process I took the 10 from my mother's shelf and put it among my things. I am not certain I decided to take it. I am certain I took it. It sat on my shelf the same as it had sat on my mother's, holding nothing, fitting in with the ordinary clutter of a household, and it might have stayed that way forever if things had been different. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. The thing about Reconstruction, and I am aware this is a word that means different things to different people, is that what it meant on the ground in that county in those years was a particular kind of instability in what you could count on. Courts opened and closed. Law changed. Who enforced what depended on who was in the county seat that month and what arrangement had been made with whom. The ordinary remedies, if you could call them that, for when a man did something that should not be done, were unreliable in ways they had not been before and would not be again. Not that they had ever been reliable in the way people like to remember, but they were more unreliable then than usual, and everyone knew it. What Aubrey Finch had done, and what he did during those years, was not the kind of thing that ever found its way to any court in any case. I want to be precise about that too. The harm he did was the kind that women in those communities absorbed without recourse, not because it was not recognized as harm, but because the mechanisms that were supposed to address it had never been built for that purpose, and everyone knew it and had always known it. The war had not changed that. Reconstruction had not changed that. The women who knew what they knew continued to know it in the same private way they had always known it. He was not a man anyone disliked openly. That is part of what I have spent 50 years trying to account for. He went to church. He paid his debts, near enough. He was considered steady, considered a man who would be there when you needed something lifted or hauled or decided. The county trusted him with a kind of practical, everyday trust that had nothing to do with what the women in the county knew about him. Those were two separate accountings that ran alongside each other without ever colliding, the way a lot of things ran in that kind of community. I saw him regularly. That was unavoidable. The county was small, the church was shared, and his farm was close enough to ours that there were seasons when our men worked each other's harvests. He was at our table twice that I remember in the first year of my marriage. He spoke to me the way he spoke to most women, with a careful politeness that said more than it concealed, if you knew how to read it, and I knew how to read it. There was a woman, named Cora, whose last name I will not say here because she has family still living in that county and this is not her confession to make. She came to me in the fall of 1867. She did not say much directly. She did not need to. I had known her since we were girls, and we understood each other in the way women who have known each other since childhood understand each other, through what is not said as much as through what is. She came to me and she sat in my kitchen and I gave her coffee and we talked about ordinary things for a while, and then we did not talk about the specific things she had come to tell me. And then she left, and I knew. That is when I began to think seriously about the 10. I want to be careful here. I am not going to tell you that I arrived at what I did in a single moment of clarity. It was not like that. It was more like how you decide anything that you have been circling for a long time, without acknowledging you are circling it. The decision was there before I named it a decision. By the time I reached for the 10 with a purpose, I'd already done most of the deciding without using that word for it. There are certain things that grow in that county along creek banks and in the margins of cotton fields that were well known to anyone who had spent time with a woman who knew plants. My mother had taught me carefully, which included teaching me what not to use, and in what amounts and under what conditions. I had paid attention. A person who is taught carefully about dangerous things learns both the danger and the use at the same time. And I don't think my mother was ignorant of this when she taught me. The nights were getting cold. I kept the 10 on the shelf and looked at it sometimes when I was alone in the kitchen and thought about Cora sitting across from me not saying the thing she had come to say. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. I need to say more about Aubrey Finch, the man, before I say what I did, because I have spent 50 years insisting to myself that the weight of this required knowing him as a person, not as a convenient shape for what I needed him to be. He was born in the county, same as most of us. His father had farmed and his grandfather before that. He had 2 brothers, one of whom died in the war. He kept a good farm. His fields were straight, his fences mended. He did not let things go the way some men let things go. He had opinions about soil and weather and the best way to cure a side of pork, and his opinions were often useful. When my father's mule went lame one spring before the war, it was Aubrey Finch who came over and spent the better part of a day looking at that leg and trying different things, and the mule recovered. My father was grateful. I was grateful too, because we needed that animal. He had a wife, Delia, who died in 1863 of a fever that took 3 children in the county that summer. He did not remarry. He had a daughter who lived with his sister's family over toward the Tennessee line. I do not know what became of her. He went to church faithfully. He had a particular spot on the right side, 3 rows back, that he occupied for 30 years or more, without anyone ever needing to tell him it was his. He sang the hymns. He bowed his head during prayer. He was regarded as a man of standing. And he had done what he had done, and was doing what he was doing, and the 2 facts about him existed simultaneously in the county without ever resolving into a single verdict. This is what I mean when I say he was a specific person. The harm he did was not the whole of him. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. A person who is only harm is not the kind of person who makes the weight of an act real. The weight came from the fact that he was also a man who spent a day with my father's mule. Those things were true at the same time. I have thought for 50 years about whether this makes what I did heavier or lighter. I have not arrived at a clear answer. Possibly it makes it neither. Possibly it is simply accurate, and accuracy is its own category. The winter of 1867 into 1868 was cold and long. Silas worked and I kept the house, and we were in those years developing the particular habits of married people. Which tasks were whose, which silences were comfortable, and which were not, when to speak, and when to leave a thing alone. He was not a difficult man to be married to. He worked hard and came in tired, and ate what was put in front of him, and did not trouble me unnecessarily. We were, in the way of that time and place, managing together. I was 23 years old. I was healthy and capable and had been raised to manage a household, and I managed it. The tin sat on the shelf. Cora came to me again in January of 1868. She did not sit down this time. She stood in my kitchen doorway for perhaps 5 minutes and then left. We did not exchange more than a dozen words. I understood what those words meant. They meant that it was continuing and that she had exhausted what she knew to do about it and had come to stand in a doorway and let me know that. I did not tell Silas. I have thought about this often over the years, whether I should have, whether it would have changed anything, what a man like Silas could have done that would have been sufficient. I do not think there was anything he could have done that would have been sufficient. I think that is the right answer. I am not entirely certain. After Cora left, I stood in my kitchen for a while, doing nothing, and then I started supper, and the evening proceeded the same as any other evening, and I lay in bed that night, and the decision that had been forming for months finished forming. I could feel it settle into something solid, a fact about what I was going to do. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. What I used and how I came to have it in the right amount, I will describe only plainly and without elaboration, because the particulars are not the point, and I am not going to make a recipe of what I did. The county had a winter sickness that moved through several households in January and February of 1868. This was not unusual. There was some fever or stomach complaint most winters, passed along through church gatherings and shared well water. When it came around, women prepared remedies and delivered them to neighbors. Lavinia had taught me several of these. I made a preparation. It was not complicated. I had what I needed from what grew along the south side of the creek bottom behind the farm, dried in the fall and stored carefully the way my mother had taught me. I want to say something about those weeks of preparation because they have a particular quality in my memory that I have not found language for before. I was calm, that is the word. Not numb, not reckless. Calm, the way you are calm when you have made a decision and the deciding is over and what remains is only the doing of it. I went about my housework. I cooked for Silas. I went to church on Sunday and sat in my pew and bowed my head at the appropriate times. None of this required any performance on my part. The calm was real. I've wondered since whether that was a moral failure, whether a person who is about to do what I was about to do should not be calm. But I don't know what the alternative would have been or what it would have accomplished. And I am old enough now to be honest about the fact that I felt what I felt. Aubrey Finch was among the men who received something from me that season. This was not unusual either. Several neighbors received things from me. I had a reputation by then as someone who knew plants, the way my mother had had a reputation. These things pass from women to daughters without ceremony. You become known as someone useful, and people come to you, or you take what you have to them, and nobody thinks much about it, because it is one of the ordinary services of a woman in a farming community. He died in March of 1868. He was ill for several days before he died. I did not attend him during his illness. That was not my place. He had neighbors closer, and his illness was not so severe at first that anyone thought much of it. By the time it was clear that it was serious, there was nothing to be done. The county had no doctor within easy distance that winter. The nearest physician was 2 hours by horse in good weather, and the weather was not good. Someone rode for him when Aubrey was clearly failing. The physician did not arrive in time. He noted afterward only that the man had died of an acute illness, the kind that passed through the county sometimes, and that was the end of the official accounting. I went to the burial. I stood with the other women of the church. I bowed my head during the prayer. I looked at the box they were putting in the ground, and I thought about Cora in my kitchen doorway, and about the woman before her, whose name I knew, and about whether there would have been another one after. And I thought about the mule, and I thought about the tin on my shelf at home, which was empty now and clean. The ground was still partly frozen. It was a gray day, the sky flat and low the way it gets in that county in March before the warmth has properly come. 3 or 4 dozen people stood in the churchyard. The preacher spoke about the uncertainty of life and the certainty of what came after. I stood and listened and thought about the uncertainty of what I was exactly and what word would fit it, and I could not find one that morning any more than I have found one since. There was no accusation. There was no inquiry. There were people in the county who suspected, I believe, or who arrived at some approximate understanding of what had happened and filed it away in the place where such understandings got filed. I saw it sometimes in certain faces, in the way certain women looked at me across the churchyard in the months that followed. Not with suspicion exactly, but with something like acknowledgement, a recognition that something had happened that they could not quite name out loud. They called it justice, or they used no word at all and let the silence speak for them, which is its own kind of verdict. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. I want to say what the weeks immediately after were like, because people might expect there to be a quality of drama to that time, and there was not. The world continued on its ordinary course. Spring planting came. Silas and I worked our fields. The church held its services. People ate and worked and quarreled about small things and repaired what needed repairing. Aubrey Finch was discussed as men are discussed after they die. His farm, his debts, what would happen to his property. The discussion moved on. I had expected to feel something clear. I had not decided what. Relief, maybe, or a particular kind of heaviness, or the thing people in sermons called guilt, which I understood to be a sensation, like a weight lodged in the chest. What I felt instead was more like the cessation of something, as if a low noise I had been hearing for a long time had stopped. Not peace, exactly, more like quiet. And the quiet was not entirely comfortable, because in the quiet you could hear things you had not been able to hear before. What I heard in the quiet was the difference between what the county had silently decided and what I knew. The county had decided, without ever gathering, without ever speaking it plainly, that whatever had happened to Aubrey Finch was a sensible outcome given the kind of man he was and the kinds of things he had done. This was not spoken aloud. It was held the way communities hold things that everyone knows, and no one is required to verify. The physician came and noted an illness and went home. The county accepted this. The county had, in its particular way, already prepared to accept this. I understood this. I had known when I decided that this was how it would go. That was part of what made it possible. If I had believed there would be a trial, a public accounting, a process that required me to stand up and say what I had done and why, I might have made a different decision. I do not know this for certain, but the absence of that process was something I had counted on, and I want to be honest about that. What I had not counted on was the particular quality of the silence, that the town's accounting would feel so entirely separate from mine, that I would carry my own accounting inside the town's, and they would never quite coincide, and that this gap would be the thing I lived with more than anything else. Silas knew, or he knew enough. He said nothing then and nothing in the 50 years after. I believe, and I have had 50 years to consider this, that his silence was deliberate and careful and not entirely unlike a gift, though it was also a way of placing the whole of it on to me without having to say so. I do not hold this against him. He was a man of his time, and he did what men of his time did with things they could not address directly. He let me carry it, and he made sure I knew he knew I was carrying it, and that was the whole of his participation. The tin. I cleaned it when I came home from the burial. I set it back on the shelf where it had always been. For a year or two it held nothing. Then I began keeping dried chamomile in it, which I used for making tea when one of us had trouble sleeping. That was the substitution I made, not deliberately, not as any kind of symbol. I needed something to put in the tin, and chamomile was what I had. But I was aware, every time I reached for it after that, of what had been there before. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet. Cora married a man from the next county over in the spring of 1869 and moved away. We did not see each other often after that. She came back twice that I remember for family events, and we spoke each time the way old friends speak when they have not seen each other in years, warmly, on the surface of things, not below it. She never said anything to me about what I had done or what she had told me without telling me. I never said anything to her. This was, I think, an agreement we had made without discussing it, and I have honored it every year of the 50 that have followed. I have wondered whether I did what I did for her specifically, or for the other woman I knew, or for whatever woman would have come next. The honest answer is that I am not certain, and the uncertainty has mattered to me. It would be tidier if I could say, I did it for Cora, for a specific person, for a clear reason with a clear object. But the truth is more like, I did it because the accumulated weight of knowing, over several years, what was being done and what was not being done about it, reached a point that exceeded my capacity to do nothing. Whether that is a reason or an excuse, I cannot tell you. I've gone back and forth on it for 50 years. The children came. Silas and I had 4, 2 boys, 2 girls, 3 of whom are still living. I raised them in the same county, in the same church, in the same community where all of this had happened. I taught my daughters what my mother had taught me. I showed them the plants along the creek bottom. I showed them what mixed with what and what you kept apart. I do not know what I intended by this. I think I intended only to give them what my mother had given me, practical knowledge, the kind that kept a household and sometimes a neighbor. But I was also aware, always, of the other thing that knowledge contained. My older daughter has her mother's memory for plants. She lives 2 counties over, and I do not see her often now that I am old. But when she comes, she sometimes asks me about a particular preparation, and I tell her what I know. I've never told her about the tin. I do not know if she has guessed. She has her grandmother's kind of knowing, which includes knowing what not to ask. The years in the middle of my life, the 1870s and 1880s, the long middle, I will describe briefly because they were mostly the ordinary business of a farming life. Cotton prices fell and rose and fell again. The boys grew and helped on the farm and eventually went their own ways. The girls grew and married, one well and one less well, and I have tried to be useful to both without involving myself in what was theirs to manage. Silas aged steadily, the way men who work hard age, the joints first, then the back, then a slowness that settled in and did not lift. He died in 1907, which means he kept the silence for 39 years. The tin sat on the shelf for all of it. The chamomile ran out sometimes, and I would refill it, and sometimes I would leave it empty for months and then find something else for it. Dried lavender for a while, then nothing. Now it holds a small amount of dried mint I keep for tea. The tin itself is the same tin. I've had it for 50 years, and it does not look much different than it did when I took it from my mother's shelf. Every time I reach for it, I remember what it held before. I do not think this will change before I die. They called it justice. I've never used that word for it. I've not found my word yet. There were particular moments in the 50 years when the gap between what the town knew and what I knew pressed hardest. I want to name some of them because I think naming them is part of the honest accounting I'm trying to do here. The first was about 2 years after Aubrey Finch died. A woman in the church, older than me, someone who had been in the county her whole life, came up to me after service one Sunday and took my hand and held it for a moment longer than was ordinary, and looked at me in a way that said she knew or believed she knew, and then she released my hand and walked away without saying anything. I've thought about that moment many times. What she was communicating was something like approval, or like solidarity, or like the particular kind of respect that a community extends to someone who has done something the community needed done and cannot acknowledge needing done. It was not an unpleasant thing to receive. That is what troubled me about it. I accepted it. I accepted the version of what I had done that her looking at me contained, and I have been aware ever since that I accepted it, and that the version she held was not my version, and that I let her version stand uncorrected, because it was the easier of the two to live inside. The second moment I will name was when my older boy was about 15. He came home from somewhere having heard, I believe, some version of the story, the county's version, not mine. He looked at me for several days afterward in a way that was not quite fear, and not quite admiration, and not quite either. He never asked me anything directly. I never offered anything. He grew up to be a man who deals in facts and does not ask questions he cannot answer. And I think some portion of that came from looking at his mother for several days when he was 15 and deciding not to ask. I think sometimes about what I would have said if he had asked. It is a useful exercise. You discover what you actually believe by trying to say it to someone who would not understand the full context. I think I would have told him the truth, not all of it. Not then, he was 15, but some honest version of it that did not use the town's word and did not perform a guilt I was not certain I felt. What I have never been able to do is use someone else's language for what I did and mean it. That is the thread that runs through all of this. The third moment was longer than a moment. It was the years after Silas died, when I was alone in the house and had more time than I had ever had, and spent parts of it sitting with what I had done in a way that daily life had not allowed before. You're busy when you're raising children and managing a household and helping an aging husband in ways that protect you from the full weight of your own knowledge. When the busyness stops, the weight does not stop with it. I spent those years, 1907 to now, 1921, 14 years, trying to find the right language for what I did. Not the town's language, not the language of church sermons, which offer only two categories, and neither of them is accurate. My own language, something that is actually true. I have sat in this house alone many evenings in those 14 years and tried the words out in the quiet, not aloud until now. But in the particular internal voice a person uses when they are being careful with themselves. Justice, no, murder. Closer to the law's meaning, but still not quite mine. Necessity, closer. Something I chose because no other option presented itself that I could live with. But necessity is also not quite it, because it implies a passivity, as if the decision made itself and I only carried it out. It did not make itself. I made it. I have not arrived at it yet. That is why I'm still talking. They called it justice. I've never used that word for it. I've not found my word yet. Let me try to describe what I have settled into across 50 years about whether I was wrong. I do not believe I was wrong in the sense that I think I should not have done it. That is not what haunts me. What haunts me is something more particular. The question of whether a person can do a necessary thing and still be required to name it honestly. Whether necessity changes what a thing is, or only changes whether it should have been done. I've gone back and forth on this many times. Some years I think necessity is a category that stands apart from right and wrong, that you can do a necessary thing that is also a wrong thing, and both are true simultaneously, and there is no resolution, only the carrying of both truths at once. Other years I think this is a way of avoiding the harder question, which is whether it was actually wrong at all, and if so, in what sense wrong, and to whom. To Aubrey Finch I did a wrong. That is clear enough. He was a person, and I ended his life without his consent, and without any process that gave him the chance to answer for himself or to be answered for by any legitimate authority. Whatever harm he did, and he did real harm to real women over real years. The accounting I gave him was mine alone, and no one appointed me to give it. But the accounting he would have gotten otherwise was nothing. That is also true. The county would have gone on absorbing what he did in the way it had always absorbed it. The women who knew would have gone on knowing in private. There would have been more chorus in more doorways, and that is not a guess. That is a reasoned certainty based on the nature of such men and the nature of such communities. So I sit with both of those things, that I wronged him, that the alternative was worse, and I cannot get them to resolve into a single verdict, and I have come to think that they will not resolve, and that this is the honest condition of what I did. The town's verdict, justice, resolves too cleanly. It takes what I did and places it in a category that erases the complexity. It says, this was right, this was needed, the person who did it is to be respected for it. It does not ask me to carry anything. It hands me a word and a quiet approval and considers the matter closed. I have not been able to use the word. Every time I approach it, I find it doesn't fit. Not because I regret what I did. I am not certain I regret it, and I have tried to be honest about this, but because the word assumes a kind of cleanness that was not there. Justice implies a proper accounting. What I did was a private decision made in a kitchen by a 23-year-old woman with a tin she had taken from her mother's shelf. It was not clean. It was not appointed. It was something else. I think the cleanness is what offends me most about the word. Clean implies that the full weight of the decision has been accounted for and found to come out in a particular direction. It is not. The full weight includes Aubrey Finch's daughter in the churchyard. It includes the piece of my anger that I have not known what to do with for 50 years. It includes the relief I felt, which I did not entirely want to feel and have not known how to file. Clean does not hold all of that. Clean leaves most of it out. I reach for the tin sometimes, the one with the mint now, the one that has been on my shelf for 50 years. And I think, what is the word? Not justice. Something more accurate than justice and less comfortable than justice and mine. I've not found it yet. They called it justice. I've never used that word for it. I've not found my word yet. There is something I have not said yet that I want to say now. In the years after Aubrey Finch died, I watched his daughter from a distance. She was living with her aunt's family, the one over toward the Tennessee line, and she came back to the county occasionally for the first few years, and I would see her at church sometimes. She was perhaps 12 or 13 when her father died. She had his coloring, the same sandy hair, the same set to her jaw. She did not know, as far as I could tell, anything in particular about the way her father had died, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. I watched her from across the churchyard and thought, here is a person whose father I killed. She has not done anything. She has lost something, whatever the complicated thing was that fathers are to their daughters, and I am the reason she lost it. This is not a thought that came to me once and then settled. It came back many times, in the first years especially. I would see her, and the thought would arrive plain as weather. I did not try to manage it or argue with it. I let it sit. I believe it was supposed to sit. I believe that if a person does what I did and does not find some version of that thought, they have made an error in their accounting. I hold this alongside everything else I hold. I do not know what to do with it, except to hold it. She married eventually and moved further away, and I lost track of her. She would be in her 60s now. I do not know if she is still living. I am telling you this because the town's verdict left her out entirely. Justice, as the town understood what happened, meant that a man who needed to be stopped was stopped, and that was the whole of the accounting. His daughter was not in the accounting. The collateral weight of a decision that fell on someone who had done nothing was not in the accounting. I have put it in mine. I have also put in mine, and this is harder to say, the fact that I was not myself, without a kind of relief when it was done. I did not only do this for Cora. I did not only do this out of a principled assessment that something needed doing. There was also a piece of it that was fear, my own, for myself, for what his continued presence in the county meant for someone like me, and a piece that was anger, which I had kept carefully managed for years, and which, at 23, had found a direction. These were also part of the decision. I have not been comfortable saying so. I am saying so now because I think it is part of the honest accounting, and because the town's verdict, justice, does not include them, and my version has to include everything or it is not mine. A private accounting that leaves out the inconvenient parts is not an accounting. It is a performance. I've been tired of performing for a long time, and at 77, I have run out of reasons to continue. The tin on the shelf holds mint. The tin I carried from my mother's house holds mint and nothing else. And every morning I reach for it, and my hand knows what it once held, and the knowledge does not prevent me from making the tea. This is what carrying something for 50 years looks like from the inside. You go on. You make the tea. You remember what you remember, and you carry what you carry, and neither the remembering nor the carrying stops the ordinary work of the day. But I have been carrying the wrong name for it, the town's name, and that is what I am trying to put down now, finally, and replace with my own. They called it justice. I've never used that word for it. I've not found my word yet. I am 77 years old, and I have been speaking this aloud for the first time in my life, or at least the first time without holding most of it back. I want to say what that is like. It is not relief exactly. Relief implies that the weight has lifted. The weight has not lifted. What has happened is more like, I can see the weight more clearly now than I could before. When you carry something for 50 years without looking at it directly, you lose the ability to describe its shape. You know it is there by its pressure on you, but you cannot quite account for its dimensions. Speaking it out loud is a way of turning it over in the light and seeing it as it is. What I see is this. I made a decision that was mine, and that I have let the town name for 50 years because their name was easier to live inside than no name at all. And the cost of that was that I have spent 50 years with an unnamed thing, a thing that everyone around me called justice, while I stood next to the word and could not quite pick it up. The cost of that is specific, and I want to name it specifically. When the town's word covers your act, you cannot examine your act. You can only examine the space between what they said and what you know. And that space is uncomfortable, but it is also empty. There is nothing there except the knowledge that the two do not match. There is no ledger, no record, no place where you can set it all down and look at it plainly. The town's silence is itself a kind of container that holds the shape of what it covers without giving you access to it. What I want is not absolution. I want precision. I want to find the word that is actually accurate to what I did and what it was. And I want to find it before I die. And I am less certain than I would like that I will. Let me try once more. I ended a man's life deliberately. I made that choice in full possession of my faculties and with a clear understanding of what I was doing. I did it because I had arrived at the conclusion, a private conclusion, reached alone, without appointment or authority, that his continued existence was causing harm that would not otherwise be stopped. I did it knowing that the community would absorb the act and call it something, and that their something would protect me from consequences. I did it also out of anger and out of a private fear that I have not fully accounted for until now. And the weight of his daughter's face across the churchyard has been with me for 50 years. That is what I did. Is that justice? I do not think so. Justice requires something I did not have: authority, process, a proper accountant that includes all the parties, including the one being judged. Is it murder? The law would say so, if the law had ever been asked. I do not dispute the law's category, but I also do not think the law's category is the whole of the truth. What it is, I think, is something closer to a decision made in a vacuum by a person with no sanctioned power to make it, that was necessary in the way a person concludes something is necessary when the alternatives have all been weighed and found insufficient, not clean, not just in the word's formal sense, not something I can set down and walk away from, but also not, and I have to say this clearly, something I believe I should not have done. I did something that needed doing in a way that I had no right to do it, and both of those things are true, and I am not capable of resolving them, and I think this is the right condition of what I did. They called it justice. I have never used that word for it. I have not found my word yet, but I am closer to it at 77 than I have ever been. I want to finish with the tin. It is sitting on the shelf in my kitchen as I speak, the same tin I took from my mother's shelf the year I married, 61 years ago, near enough. The lid fits tight, the way it always did. The sides are dented in one place where I dropped it sometime in the 1890s. It holds dried mint now, the same mint I've been keeping in it for the past several years. When I reach for it in the mornings to make my tea, my hand knows exactly how it feels before I touch it. The weight of it, the particular roughness at the edge of the lid. My mother kept it before me, and I have kept it after. It is an ordinary object that has been in my life longer than all but a few of the people who have passed through it. When I am gone, it will be my daughter's or my son's or no one's, and whoever has it will not know what was in it once, or the use I put it to, or the 50 years of reaching for it with that awareness. The mint inside it smells nothing like what was in it before. I want to say that clearly. It's a clean smell, ordinary, the kind that belongs in a kitchen with nothing sinister in its history. And yet I reach for it, and my hand knows and has known for 50 years, and I think this is right. I think a person should be required to remember what their hands have done, not as punishment necessarily, as accuracy. I am going to say finally what I think my word might be. Not justice, not murder, because that is the law's word, and the law was not present in this accounting. Not mercy, which is not the right direction. What I think I did, the word I have come closest to in 50 years of searching, is an intervention, not in any formal sense, in the plain sense of the word, which is that I placed myself between what was happening and what would have continued to happen, using the only means available to me, without sanction, without process, at a cost I have been paying ever since. It is not a satisfying word. It is not a word the town would understand as accounting for what I did, and it is not a word that settles anything moral, but it is the word that is most accurate to my experience of what I decided and why, and what it has been to carry. An intervention made in a kitchen by a woman who knew plants, who took a tin from her mother's shelf and kept it on her own for 60 years after, and who has been reaching for it every morning of those years, knowing exactly what it once held and what it holds now, and finding in that small substitution the whole shape of what she did, and what it cost, and what it was. I do not ask anyone to agree with what I did. I do not ask anyone to find the word I have found adequate. But I am 77 years old, and I have let other people's language cover what was mine to name for too long, and I am naming it now in the only way I can. They called it justice. I've never used that word for it. I have not found the word that fully fits, but intervention is closer than anything else I have tried, and I am 77 years old, and I believe this is as close as I am going to get. The mint is almost gone. I will need to dry more in the summer if I am still here in the summer, and I believe I will be. Fill the tin again. Keep it on the shelf where it has always been. Reach for it in the morning. That is all I have left to say.